Hello, welcome, my name's Andy, thanks for joining me for this video. Just a few quick thoughts today about the passage for next Sunday, which is a really interesting one, a really strange one in parts actually. Okay, so it's Mark 13, 1-8. Now Mark 13 is very different from the rest of the book of Mark. You can spot it straight away. Jesus talks about a sort of destruction and a time where there'll be wars and earthquakes, and it's quite different in tone to the rest of the book. But let's try and unpack it. First off, last week we had Jesus in the temple, if you remember, criticising the people with their long robes and their lengthy prayers and the people who exploit the widows. And straight after that, in 13.1, it says, as he left the temple. So Jesus leaves the temple. And that's not just a little sort of a sort of thing to just make the story flow, connect one thing to another. We've got here God leaving the temple. God leaves the temple. Now the temple was the place where God lived. So if God leaves the temple, something's going on. Back in Ezekiel 10, I don't know if you might want to check back, that was the previous time that God left the temple. And it all went very badly from then on, because the Israelite nation at the time were just had all the wrong attitudes, all the wrong values. God left the temple then just before the nation was captured by Babylonians. So here we've got Jesus leaving the temple. Okay, now, so Jesus wants to do something bigger than the temple. This temple's not enough. And then the disciples, and this is so typical of people all over. The disciples say, "Teacher, look at the stones, look at the buildings." They're really impressed by the building. They're really impressed by the temple building. Now these disciples, they would have been people who, probably lived in the countryside. They wouldn't have been to the city very often. They probably were quite generally impressed. It was an impressive building. The temple was, it's an incredible building. The person, Herod, who funded it, this rebuilding of the temple, we think he was the richest person to ever live before or after, in comparison with the people who lived in the country. So he was a very, very wealthy man, and he funded this temple. It was impressive. But Jesus, who you'd expect to be quite keen on the religious building, he's God. The temple is God's house, supposedly. Jesus is pretty unimpressed. He just says to them, all these buildings will be torn down. Not a stone will be left standing. Stone will be thrown on stone. So Jesus says, well, it looks good, but, not going to last. He wasn't interested in being tied down to a building. Today, the church, we are God's temple. God's Spirit lives in us, not in a building anymore. We have a temple made of flesh, and that's an amazing thing. So Jesus didn't want to be tied to a building. He always had a vision of something much bigger. Good as that temple was, the whole world, all the people are God's temple now. Now the last bit of this passage, it gets a bit strange. So from verse 5 onwards, it's got a bit where Jesus talks about wars and rumours of wars and earthquakes and nation divided against nation. It gets very what we call apocalyptic, talking about an end time. And I'm not too sure what to do with this bit, to be honest. It's written in a very different style to the rest of the book of Mark, as I said. I don't know if you know, but Mark didn't just write the book from start to finish in his own words. He cut and pasted bits from different other stories that he'd heard, or other bits that were written down. And he adds in his own bits to sort of top and tail each story. If you look carefully, you can kind of see the signs of him stitching this thing together. And this next bit, we think, is from a book we've called it The Little Apocalypse. It's a book which we think was written around about the year 66 to 70, and it was at a time when the Jewish inhabitants of Jerusalem were at war against the Roman Empire. They had a rebellion. So this was 30 odd years after Jesus' time, around about the time that Mark's Gospel was being put together. And we think that there was this book called The Little Apocalypse, which was at this time of huge turmoil, that was written to express what was going on at that time. And Mark seems to have slipped it into his Gospel here. So the temple was destroyed. In the year 70, the temple was destroyed. Sorry, if you can hear that noise in the background, I'm cooking some potatoes. I'm a bit worried about it because I think they're going to boil over, but I think they're just about okay. So excuse any background noise. The temple was destroyed. It was burned actually by the Roman army. They set fire to it all and trashed it. The stones were reused. They were, people built. All the stones are all over Jerusalem now. They repurposed them for other buildings. Just a little bit was left, which we now call the Western Wall, or sometimes the Wailing Wall. That's the only bit left of the original temple. So the temple was destroyed. There's a new temple. God is everywhere. God isn't tied down to our human buildings, to our man-made buildings. So there's a challenge for us who are in churches. Perhaps our church buildings are particularly lovely. Perhaps we like them. Perhaps we're very fond of them. This passage, I think, is quite challenging for us because it's saying that we can't get too attached to it. God isn't particularly attached to church buildings. I think that's the message of this. So therefore, neither should we. Okay, I think that's it for this week. Hope to see you soon. Okay, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.